Little girl calls 911 and says, "This happens when I'm alone with Daddy." The truth leaves everyone in tears. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the emergency line at the Pinewood County Dispatch Center received a call that would change many lives forever. Jessica Miller, a 5-year veteran dispatcher, was just settling in with her third cup of coffee when the phone rang. 911, what's your emergency? She answered, her voice calm and practiced. At first there was only silence on the line. Then came a small voice, barely above a whisper. "This happens when I'm alone with Daddy." Jessica sat up straighter, her training kicking in. The voice belonged to a child, a little girl by the sound of it. She kept her tone gentle but clear. "Hi there, sweetheart. My name is Jessica. Can you tell me your name?" A pause then. "Sophie. I'm 7. "That's a beautiful name, Sophie. Can you tell me where you are right now?" "I'm at home, in the kitchen. Daddy had to go help his friend, but he said he'd be back soon." Sophie's voice trembled slightly. "I wasn't supposed to call anyone, but my arms really hurt." Jessica typed quickly, signaling her supervisor with a silent gesture. "Sophie, you did the right thing calling us. Can you tell me what's happening with your arms?" Another hesitation. Jessica could hear the child's breathing, slightly rapid. "They get all red and itchy," Sophie finally said. "And sometimes they burn. It happens a lot when I'm in my room, and when Daddy comes home from his smelly job." Jessica's fingers paused over her keyboard. This wasn't quite what she'd expected to hear. "Sophie, is there someone else at home with you right now?" "No. Mom had to go to the doctor again for her back. Daddy said he'd be back in an hour, but he always says that." As Jessica continued the conversation, her colleague was already dispatching Officer James Parker to the address they'd traced from the call. A 7-year-old alone at home with mysterious marks on her arms required immediate attention. "Sophie, I'm going to stay on the phone with you, okay? I've sent a police officer to come check on you. He's really nice, and his name is Officer Parker." "Am I in trouble?" Sophie's voice quavered. "Not at all, sweetheart. We just want to make sure you're okay." Through the line, Jessica heard a distant sound, a car door slamming. "I think someone's here," Sophie whispered, a note of fear entering her voice. "Can you see who it is from where you are?" Jessica asked calmly, though her pulse quickened. "I can't see the driveway from here," Sophie replied. "But I hear footsteps now." Jessica heard it too, the sound of approaching steps through the phone. "Sophie, if you're scared, you can find a place to hide until our officer arrives." The sound of a doorknob turning came through the line. Sophie's breathing became quicker. "He's coming back now," she whispered. Then the line went dead. Outside the modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, the blue and red lights of Officer Parker's patrol car flashed silently as he approached the front door, unaware of just how complicated this call was about to become. Officer James Parker approached the front door of the small house on Maple Street with measured steps. At 42, he'd responded to countless calls involving children, each one leaving its mark on him. As a father himself, these calls always hit differently. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a man in his early 30s with worry etched across his face. He wore faded jeans and a t-shirt with a local garage logo. Dark circles under his eyes suggested someone who hadn't slept properly in days. "Are you Robert Miller?" Parker asked, keeping his voice even. "Yes. What's going on? Why are the police here?" Robert glanced anxiously over his shoulder. "Is it about Elaine? Did something happen at the doctor's?" Before Parker could answer, a small figure appeared behind Robert. Sophie Miller had curly brown hair pulled back in uneven pigtails and large, observant eyes that seemed too serious for her 7 years. She clutched a well-loved stuffed rabbit missing one ear. "Hi there," Parker said, kneeling down to Sophie's level. "You must be Sophie. I'm Officer Parker." Sophie's eyes widened in recognition. "Jessica sent you," she whispered. Robert looked between them, confusion deepening the lines on his forehead. "Jessica? Who's Jessica? Sophie, did you call someone?" Parker gently took control of the situation. "Mr. Miller, Sophie called 911 a little while ago. She mentioned something about her arms hurting when she's alone with you. Robert's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, confusion, and then a dawning horror. What? Sophie, why would you? He stopped mid-sentence, noticing how his daughter was holding her arms against her chest, partially hidden by the stuffed rabbit. Sophie, can I see your arms, please? Parker asked softly. The little girl hesitated, looking up at her father, then slowly extended her arms. Both Parker and Robert drew in sharp breaths. Angry red patches covered Sophie's forearms, some areas raised and irritated where she'd clearly been scratching. My God, Sophie, Robert whispered. When did this get so bad? It always gets worse when it rains, Sophie said simply. And when you come home from your night job. Parker observed the genuine shock on Robert's face. This wasn't the reaction of someone who knew what was causing these marks. Mr. Miller, I'd like to come in and talk about this if that's okay. Robert nodded numbly, stepping aside. As they entered the modest living room, Parker noted the worn but clean furniture, family photos on the walls, and a corner filled with Sophie's drawings, a normal family home that somehow held a mystery. Sophie led them to the kitchen table where crayons and paper were scattered across the surface. One drawing caught Parker's eye, a small figure with red spots on its arms standing next to a larger figure surrounded by what looked like gray clouds. Is this you and your dad? Parker asked, pointing to the drawing. Sophie nodded. That's Daddy coming home with his cloud. That's when my arms get really itchy. Robert ran a hand through his hair, looking lost. Sophie, honey, I don't understand. What cloud? The smell cloud that follows you from your chemical job, Sophie explained as if it were obvious. It makes the monsters in my room worse. Parker and Robert exchanged glances. There was clearly more to this story than either of them understood yet. Sophie, Parker said gently, can you show me your room and these monsters you're talking about? Sophie nodded solemnly, clutching her rabbit tighter. They're in the walls. They come out when it's wet. As they followed the little girl down the narrow hallway, Parker couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to discover something important. Something that would explain the mysterious connection between Sophie's marks, her father's, cloud, and the monsters that only a 7-year-old could see clearly. Sophie's bedroom was small but filled with personality. Colorful drawings were taped to the walls, a bookshelf overflowed with well-loved children's books, and a collection of stuffed animals formed a protective circle on her bed. But Officer Parker immediately noticed what seemed out of place. Dark patches stained the ceiling corners, and there was a distinct musty smell that intensified as they entered. See? The monsters live there. Sophie pointed to the darkest corner where the ceiling met the wall. They get bigger when it rains. Parker moved closer to examine the area. What Sophie called monsters was clearly an aggressive mold growth spreading down the wall behind her bed. He pulled out his phone and took several photos. How long has this been here, Mr. Miller? He asked, keeping his tone neutral. Robert stared at the mold with a mixture of shock and dismay. I knew we had some dampness issues, but I didn't realize it had gotten this bad in here. He touched the wall gingerly. The landlord promised to fix the roof last year, but then he sold the building, and the new owner keeps saying he'll get to it. Parker noticed Sophie unconsciously scratching her arms again. And these marks on Sophie's arms, when did they first appear? Robert's face clouded with worry. About 2 months ago, I think. Elaine, my wife, thought it might be seasonal allergies or eczema. We've been putting cream on them, but... He trailed off, clearly distressed that the condition had worsened despite their efforts. Sophie walked to her small dresser and opened the top drawer. My arms get really itchy when I wear these. She pulled out a t-shirt that had been neatly folded. Parker carefully took the shirt, noting how Robert's face suddenly changed. Those are my work uniforms, Robert said slowly, realization dawning. I've been keeping them in Sophie's dresser because our closet is too small. He turned to Parker with growing horror. I work night shifts at the chemical plant across town. I always shower there before coming home, but chemicals can linger in fabric, Parker finished for him. He carefully placed the shirt in a plastic evidence bag he carried. Sophie, does your dad hug you when he comes home from work? Sophie nodded. Every morning when he gets back. Even though he's tired, he comes to say good morning before I go to school. Robert sank onto Sophie's bed, his face in his hands. I've been causing this? All this time? Parker placed a reassuring hand on Robert's shoulder. We don't know that for certain yet, but I think we need to have Sophie examined by a doctor to determine exactly what's causing these marks. A noise from the front of the house caught their attention, the door opening, followed by a woman's voice calling out anxiously. Robert? Sophie? Why is there a police car outside? Sophie brightened. Mom's home. They returned to the living room to find Elaine Miller leaning heavily on a cane, her face pale with worry. She was a slim woman with the same curly hair as her daughter, though hers was pulled back in a hasty ponytail. Dark circles under her eyes suggested chronic pain or sleepless nights, possibly both. What's happening? She asked, her eyes darting between her husband, daughter, and the police officer. Parker introduced himself and began explaining the situation as gently as possible. As he spoke, Elaine's expression shifted from fear to confusion and finally to a mother's anguish as she examined the marks on Sophie's arms. I thought it was just eczema, she whispered. Sophie had a patch last year that the doctor said was eczema. I've been putting cream on it whenever she complained, but with my back appointments and the medication. Mrs. Miller, Parker said kindly, I believe Sophie needs to see a doctor specializing in skin conditions, and your home needs to be inspected. I'm going to call someone who can help with both. As Parker stepped aside to make the call, he watched the family huddle together on the worn couch, Robert with his arm protectively around Elaine, Sophie nestled between them with her rabbit. Despite their obvious worry, there was love in that small circle. Parker was increasingly convinced that this wasn't a case of intentional harm, but rather a complex situation where good intentions had led to unexpected consequences. The real question now was, what exactly was causing Sophie's condition, and how many factors were at play in this family's struggling home? Within an hour, the Miller home had become the center of unexpected activity. Officer Parker had called in Dr. Catherine Reynolds, a pediatric dermatologist with the county health department, who specialized in unusual skin conditions. She arrived with a gentle smile and a colorful medical bag that immediately caught Sophie's attention. That's a pretty bag, Sophie said shyly as Dr. Reynolds knelt beside her on the couch. Thank you. I keep it colorful so children don't feel scared, Dr. Reynolds replied, opening it to reveal compartments neatly organized with medical equipment and sample containers. Would you mind if I take a look at your arms, Sophie? As the doctor examined Sophie's skin, Parker stepped outside with Robert to talk privately on the front porch. The afternoon had turned overcast, with dark clouds gathering in the distance. Mr. Miller, can you tell me more about your work at the chemical plant? Parker asked. Robert leaned against the porch railing, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. I started about 3 months ago. The pay is better than my day job at the garage, so I've been working both. Night shifts at the plant, day shifts at the garage when they need me. He rubbed his eyes. We've been trying to save for a better place. Somewhere without... He gestured vaguely toward the house. All these problems. What kind of chemicals do you work with? Parker pressed gently. Industrial solvents, mostly. We manufacture cleaning agents for commercial use. Robert's eyes suddenly widened. They make us shower before leaving, wear protective gear. They're always talking about how the chemicals can cause skin irritation if not handled properly. His voice broke. I never thought... I've been so careful. Parker nodded thoughtfully. The uniforms in Sophie's room. Why were they stored there? Our bedroom closet is tiny and we use most of it for Elaine's medical equipment. Her back brace, the TENS unit, her heating pads. Robert shook his head. Sophie's dresser had an empty drawer, so I've been keeping my work clothes there. I always meant it to be temporary, just until we could move somewhere bigger. A car pulled up to the curb, a county vehicle with environmental health services on the door. A middle-aged woman with a tablet and testing equipment emerged. That's Diane Woods from the county, Parker explained. She'll check your home for environmental issues, mold, air quality, that sort of thing. Inside, Dr. Reynolds was talking quietly with Elaine while Sophie colored at the kitchen table, occasionally glancing up at the adults with curious eyes. "I've taken several samples," Dr. Reynolds explained as Parker and Robert rejoined them. "From what I can see, Sophie has a fairly severe case of contact dermatitis. Essentially, her skin is reacting to something in her environment." "Is it the mold in her room?" Elaine asked anxiously. "That could certainly be contributing," Dr. Reynolds replied. "But the pattern of the inflammation suggests multiple irritants. The samples I've taken will tell us more specifically what we're dealing with." Diane Woods entered with her equipment. After brief introductions, she began setting up air quality monitors and taking samples from the walls in Sophie's room. "This mold situation is quite serious," she said, frowning at her readings. "Has anyone in the family experienced respiratory issues? Coughing, wheezing, congestion?" "Sophie had what we thought was a cold last month," Elaine said slowly. "It lasted longer than usual." Parker watched as the pieces began forming a clearer picture. A family struggling financially, a father working 2 jobs and unknowingly bringing industrial chemicals home, a mother dealing with chronic health issues, and a child caught in the middle of it all. Sophie approached him, holding up her latest drawing. It showed a house with a smiling sun above it, very different from the gloomy home they were standing in. "This is where we're going to live someday," she explained seriously. "Daddy says we just need to save more dollars first." Parker felt his heart tighten. "It's a beautiful house, Sophie. There won't be any monsters there," she added confidently. "And Daddy won't bring home his cloud. And Mommy's back won't hurt so much." As the experts continued their work, Parker stepped outside again to call his supervisor. This wasn't a case for the police, but for social services and public health. Yet something told him he shouldn't walk away from this family just yet. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important part of his job wasn't enforcing the law, but connecting people with the help they desperately needed, but didn't know how to find. From the doorway, Sophie watched him, her arms now wrapped in soft gauze that Dr. Reynolds had applied. Her eyes held a wisdom beyond her years, the quiet resilience of a child who had learned to live with difficulties, but still believed in better days ahead. The next morning found the Millers at the county health center, where Sophie was scheduled for additional tests. The waiting room was bright and cheerful, with colorful murals of animals and nature scenes covering the walls. Sophie sat between her parents, drawing in a new sketchbook that Officer Parker had brought her the previous evening before leaving. "What are you drawing now, sweetheart?" Elaine asked, trying to keep her voice light despite her obvious worry. Sophie tilted the sketchbook to show a picture of their family standing in front of a house with a red door. "This is our new house, the one without monsters." Robert and Elaine exchanged glances over their daughter's head. The previous night had been difficult. After the environmental specialist left, they'd moved Sophie's mattress to the living room, away from the mold-infested walls of her bedroom. Robert had slept on the couch, afraid that residual chemicals on his skin might worsen Sophie's condition. Sophie Miller. A nurse appeared at the doorway with a clipboard. As they stood to follow her, the clinic doors opened, and Officer Parker walked in, now dressed in casual clothes instead of his uniform. "Officer Parker." Sophie's face lit up. She ran to him, sketchbook clutched to her chest. "I'm off duty today," he explained to the surprised parents. "But I wanted to check how things were going and let you know that I've contacted someone who might be able to help with your housing situation." "You didn't have to do that," Robert said, clearly touched by the officer's continued involvement. "Sometimes my job is about more than just responding to calls," Parker replied with a warm smile. "Besides, I'd like to see this through." The nurse led them to an examination room where Dr. Reynolds was waiting with another doctor, a tall man with kind eyes and a colorful bow tie. "This is Dr. Patel," Dr. Reynolds introduced him. "He's our environmental medicine specialist." While the doctors examined Sophie and asked her questions, Elaine explained to Parker in hushed tones how the hospital had fast-tracked their case after receiving the preliminary test results from their home. "They said it was a public health priority," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I never thought We were just trying to get by, you know? Robert taking that second job was supposed to be our way out of that house, not—" Her voice broke. Parker placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You were both doing your best with what you had." Dr. Reynolds joined them while Dr. Patel continued talking with Sophie, showing her something on his tablet that made her giggle. "We've identified at least 3 distinct factors contributing to Sophie's condition," she explained quietly. "The mold in her bedroom is a significant respiratory irritant and can cause skin reactions in sensitive individuals. But there's something else." Just then, Sophie called out, "Mommy, Daddy, Dr. Patel says the monsters in my room are actually tiny mushrooms. They're alive and throwing invisible spores everywhere." Despite the seriousness of the situation, the adults couldn't help but smile at Sophie's excitement over this scientific explanation for what had frightened her. "But I still don't understand about Daddy's cloud," she added, her brow furrowing in confusion. Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Patel exchanged meaningful glances. "That," Dr. Reynolds said, "is what we need to talk about next. And I think we're finally beginning to understand exactly what's been happening to Sophie." Dr. Patel guided everyone to a small conference room adjacent to the examination area. The walls were lined with medical posters and children's artwork, creating a less clinical atmosphere. Sophie immediately spotted a box of crayons on a side table and asked if she could color while the adults talked. "Of course," Dr. Reynolds smiled, pulling out some blank paper from a drawer. "Maybe you could draw what you think your dad's cloud looks like." As Sophie settled at the corner of the table with her art supplies, the doctors turned to Robert and Elaine with serious expressions. "What we're dealing with here is something called multiple chemical sensitivity," Dr. Patel began. "In Sophie's case, it's been triggered by a perfect storm of environmental factors." He pulled up images on his tablet showing microscopic views of mold spores and chemical compounds. "The mold in your home has been sensitizing Sophie's immune system, making her more reactive to other irritants. But what's particularly interesting is the chemical residue we found on the samples from her skin." Dr. Reynolds gently took over. "The industrial solvents from your workplace, Robert, even in trace amounts, are creating a reaction when they come in contact with Sophie's already sensitized skin." Robert's face paled. "So it is my fault." "No," Dr. Patel said firmly. "This isn't about fault. You've been following your workplace safety protocols, but those are designed to protect the workers, not necessarily their families. This is actually a recognized issue in industrial medicine called take-home exposure." Elaine reached for Robert's hand, squeezing it tightly. Parker noticed the gesture, a small act of solidarity in the face of overwhelming information. "What happens now?" Elaine asked, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "How do we help Sophie?" "First, you need alternative housing immediately," Dr. Reynolds stated. "The mold remediation alone will take weeks, and that's assuming the structural issues causing the dampness are addressed." Parker cleared his throat. "That's where I might be able to help. There's a county emergency housing program for families facing health crises. I've already spoken with the coordinator, and they may have a temporary apartment available." Elaine's composure finally broke. "I don't understand why you're helping us so much," she whispered to Parker. "When Sophie called 911, I was terrified they'd take her away from us because of the condition of our home." "That's not how this works," Parker replied gently. "My job isn't to punish families in difficult situations. It's to ensure everyone's safety and connect people with resources." From the corner of the table, Sophie held up her drawing. "I finished Daddy's cloud." The adults turned to see her artwork, a figure representing Robert surrounded by wispy gray tendrils that reached toward a smaller figure with red dots on her arms. "Sophie has been trying to tell us all along," Dr. Reynolds said quietly. "Children often understand things intuitively, even when they don't have the words to explain." Dr. Patel studied the drawing with professional interest. "Sophie, what happens when Daddy's cloud touches you?" "It makes my arms burn," she replied matter-of-factly, "especially when I'm in my room with the monsters." The pieces were finally coming together, forming a clear picture of what had been happening in the Miller household. But for Robert and Elaine, this clarity brought a new weight of parental guilt, that Parker could see etched on their faces. "This isn't the end of the story," he assured them. "It's just the beginning of finding solutions." Later that afternoon, Officer Parker accompanied environmental health specialist Diane Woods back to the Miller home for a more thorough inspection. The house stood quiet and empty, with the family temporarily relocated to a hotel paid for by the county's emergency assistance program. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, Diane remarked as she set up her equipment in Sophie's bedroom. "But I've rarely seen a case where so many factors lined up perfectly to create a health crisis." Parker watched as she used a specialized camera to examine the walls, revealing the extensive spread of mold behind the seemingly innocent surface. "Is this common in rental properties?" "More common than it should be," Diane replied, her tone professional but tinged with frustration. "Especially in older buildings where landlords defer maintenance." She pointed to the ceiling corner. "Water's been seeping in from the roof for months, maybe years. Perfect breeding ground for toxic mold species." As they moved through the house, Parker found himself seeing it through new eyes. Not just as a police officer responding to a call, but as someone trying to understand the full story of the family who lived here. The worn furniture suddenly spoke of hard choices rather than neglect. The carefully organized medication bottles on Elaine's nightstand told of ongoing health struggles. The calendar on the refrigerator packed with work shifts and doctor appointments revealed parents stretched to their limits. In the kitchen, Diane tested the water and air quality while Parker examined the family photos magneted to the refrigerator. One showed a younger, healthier-looking Elaine holding a toddler Sophie, with Robert standing proudly beside them in front of what appeared to be a different, brighter apartment. "They've been working so hard just to stay afloat," Parker murmured. "That's the story of too many families," Diane agreed, looking up from her testing kit. "One health crisis, one job loss, one unexpected expense, and the whole house of cards can come tumbling down." Moving back to Sophie's room, Parker opened her dresser drawer where Robert's work uniforms had been stored. Using gloves, he carefully lifted one, and Diane waved a detecting device over the fabric. "Significant chemical residue," she confirmed. "Industrial-grade solvents. Not enough to harm an adult with regular contact, but for a child with sensitized skin sleeping in a room with these volatile compounds released into the air." She shook her head. "No wonder Sophie developed such a severe reaction." Parker's phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Reynolds. "Lab results confirm our theory. Multiple chemical sensitivity triggered by mold exposure and exacerbated by industrial solvent residue. Meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss treatment plan with family." As they finished their inspection, thunder rumbled in the distance. Parker walked to Sophie's window and looked out at the gathering storm. Rain would only make the mold problem worse, he realized. The Millers couldn't come back here, not until major repairs were completed. "We need to document everything," he told Diane. "The landlord needs to be held accountable for these conditions." "Already on it," she replied, her camera clicking steadily as she photographed each problem area. "This goes beyond simple code violations. This is endangering a child's health." As they prepared to leave, Parker noticed a small stuffed rabbit that Sophie had forgotten in her hasty departure. He picked it up gently, brushing off a light coating of dust from its worn fur. This forgotten toy seemed to embody the innocence caught in the crossfire of adult problems that no 7-year-old should have to understand. "I'll make sure she gets this back," he said, carefully placing the rabbit in a clean evidence bag to prevent any further contamination. Outside, the first heavy raindrops began to fall, drumming on the roof that had failed to protect the family beneath it for far too long. The conference room at the County Health Center was filled with morning sunlight as Dr. Catherine Reynolds organized her files. She'd arrived early to review all the test results one final time before meeting with the Millers. This case had kept her awake most of the night, not just because of its medical complexity, but because of the family at its center. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Officer Parker stood at the doorway holding a cardboard tray with coffee cups and a small paper bag. "Thought you might need this," he said, placing a coffee on the table beside her. "The cinnamon roll is from Maggie's Bakery downtown. Best in the county." Dr. Reynolds smiled gratefully. "You're not required to be here today, you know. This is really a medical consultation now, not a police matter. Parker shrugged, taking a seat. I told the Millers I'd see this through. Besides, I brought something for Sophie. He patted his jacket pocket where a small bulge revealed the rescued stuffed rabbit. Dr. Reynolds studied him for a moment. 20 years in medicine, and I still find myself surprised by how cases affect different people. What was it about this family that got to you? Parker considered the question. I have a daughter about Sophie's age, and I guess I saw how easily good people can fall through the cracks. The Millers were doing everything right, working hard, taking care of each other, but life just kept piling on challenges. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patel, followed shortly by the Miller family. Sophie immediately ran to Officer Parker, while Robert and Elaine entered more cautiously, the weight of worry evident in their postures. Sophie, I found someone who missed you, Parker said, producing the stuffed rabbit from his pocket. Hoppy, Sophie exclaimed, hugging the toy tightly. I thought he was still with the monsters. I made sure he was safe, Parker assured her with a wink. Dr. Reynolds began the meeting by spreading out several images on the table. Microscope views of skin samples, chemical compound diagrams, and mold spore photographs. We've completed all our tests, and now we have a clear picture of what's been happening, she explained. Sophie has developed what we call multiple chemical sensitivity, due to prolonged exposure to 3 main factors. She pointed to the mold images. First, the toxic mold in your home sensitized her immune system, making it hyper-reactive. Next, she indicated the chemical diagrams. Second, the industrial solvents from Robert's work clothes created a secondary irritant. And third, she pointed to water sample results. Your home's old pipes are leaching small amounts of metals that further compound the problem. The perfect storm, Dr. Patel added quietly. Is it permanent? Elaine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Reynolds' expression softened. No. Children's immune systems are remarkably resilient. With proper treatment and, most importantly, removal from the triggering environment, Sophie should recover completely. Relief washed over Robert's face. And the treatment? What does she need? We'll start with medicated creams for her skin and some oral antihistamines, Dr. Reynolds explained. But the most important medicine is clean air and a mold-free environment. Which brings us to your housing situation, Officer Parker interjected gently. The hotel is just a temporary solution. Sophie, who had been quietly reuniting with her rabbit, suddenly looked up. Are we going to live in my drawing? The house with no monsters? The adults exchanged glances, and Dr. Reynolds noticed how Robert's shoulders slumped slightly. A father feeling the weight of not being able to provide the safe home his child deserved. Actually, Parker said, pulling out a folder, I've been talking with the County Housing Assistance Program. There's a temporary apartment available in the Riverside complex while your landlord makes the legally required repairs to your current home. Riverside? Elaine's eyes widened. But that's a nice area. We could never afford. It's a subsidized unit, Parker explained. Part of a program for families facing health-related housing crises. You qualify. As the details were discussed, Dr. Reynolds watched Sophie whispering secrets to her rabbit, seemingly unconcerned with the adult conversation. Children were often like that, she reflected, completely aware of problems but equally confident that adults would eventually sort things out. The question now was whether the adults in Sophie's life could actually deliver on that innocent faith. The Riverside Apartments complex was a world away from the Millers' previous home. Clean beige buildings surrounded a central courtyard with a small playground and picnic area. As Officer Parker helped the family move their few belongings into the temporary unit, he noticed how Sophie immediately ran to the windows, pressing her hands against the glass in wonder. Look, Hoppy, she told her rabbit, we can see trees from our house now. While Elaine helped Sophie explore their new temporary home, Parker found Robert standing alone in the small kitchenette, staring at the gleaming countertops with an unreadable expression. Everything okay? Parker asked, setting down a box of kitchen supplies. Robert didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with emotion. I worked so hard to keep them safe, to give them better than what I had growing up. And all this time, I was the one making Sophie sick. Parker leaned against the counter beside him. You know that's not true. You were doing everything you could with the information you had. Maybe if I'd paid more attention. To what? Industrial chemical transfer rates, mold growth patterns, environmental medicine? Parker shook his head. Those are things specialists spend years studying. Robert ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Parker had come to recognize as a sign of his distress. I never told you about my childhood, did I? You didn't have to. I grew up in foster care, Robert continued anyway, his voice low so Sophie wouldn't overhear. My biological parents were... He searched for an appropriate word, unable to care for me. I bounced between 6 different homes before I turned 18. He glanced toward the living room where Sophie was showing Elaine which drawer would be perfect for Hoppy's clothes. When I met Elaine, she was pregnant and alone. Sophie's biological father left the picture before she was even born. The moment I held that tiny baby in the hospital, I promised her and myself that she would always have a stable home, that she would always feel safe. Parker understood now why this situation had hit Robert so hard. It wasn't just about Sophie's physical health. It was about a deeply personal promise he felt he had failed to keep. You know what Sophie told me yesterday at the hotel? Parker asked. She said she wasn't scared of the monsters in her room anymore because her daddy would chase them away from the new house. That doesn't sound like a child who feels unsafe to me. Robert blinked rapidly, fighting back emotion. Mr. Miller, Robert, Parker continued, I've been a police officer for 15 years. I've seen all kinds of families. Trust me when I tell you that what matters most isn't the perfect house or the perfect circumstances. It's having parents who keep trying even when things get tough. From the living room came the sound of Sophie's laughter as Elaine helped her bounce on the edge of the sofa, a small moment of joy amid all the upheaval. I need to make this right, Robert said finally. I can't keep working at the chemical plant, not if it means putting Sophie at risk. Actually, Parker replied, I've been talking with Dr. Patel about that. There are protocols for workers in your industry, special laundering services, separate changing facilities. Your employer should be providing those resources. Really? Really. And if they're not, then they're violating occupational safety regulations. Parker pulled out his phone and showed Robert a website. This is the number for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They have resources specifically for workers in your situation. For the first time in days, a glimmer of hope appeared in Robert's eyes. So I don't have to choose between providing for my family and keeping them safe? That's exactly right. And speaking of providing, Parker added, the hospital has a program that might help with Elaine's ongoing medical needs. I took the liberty of bringing the paperwork. Robert looked at Parker with newfound respect. Why are you doing all this for us? Going so far beyond your job? Parker glanced toward Sophie, who was now carefully arranging Hoppy on her new bed. Let's just say I believe every child deserves a champion. Sometimes that's their parents. Sometimes it's a teacher or a doctor. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's the police officer who answered a call. 3 days after moving into the Riverside apartments, Elaine sat in the small living room, surrounded by medical bills spread across the coffee table. The afternoon sunlight illuminated the staggering numbers that seemed to mock all their efforts to get ahead. Despite the improved living conditions, the financial pressure had only intensified. Her back pain flared as she leaned forward to sort another stack of papers. The stress of the past week had aggravated her chronic condition, but she'd been rationing her medication, knowing they couldn't afford a refill until Robert's next paycheck. The apartment door opened, and Sophie bounded in from her first day back at school since the move, her backpack bouncing and her eyes bright with excitement. Mom, my arms didn't itch at all today, she announced triumphantly, holding out her forearms for inspection. The angry red patches were noticeably fading, with only light pink marks remaining as evidence of her ordeal. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Elaine said, quickly gathering the bills and shoving them into a folder. How was school? Great. I told everyone about our new house and how Officer Parker saved us from the monsters, and Ms. Jenkins said I could bring Hoppy for show and tell on Friday. Elaine smiled despite her worries. Children were remarkably resilient. Already Sophie was bouncing back while the adults were still drowning in the aftermath. "Is Daddy coming home for dinner?" Sophie asked, heading to the kitchen for a snack. "Not tonight, honey. Remember how we talked about Daddy needing to work extra shifts this week?" The truth was more complicated. Robert had confronted his supervisor at the chemical plant about the lack of proper decontamination protocols, armed with information from OSHA that Parker had provided. The confrontation had not gone well. Now he was working double shifts at the garage to make up for the lost income while looking for a new job. As Sophie settled at the table with her homework and an apple, the phone rang. Elaine answered to find Dr. Reynolds on the line. "Mrs. Miller, I'm calling with some news about Sophie's treatment plan," the doctor began. "The specialist who reviewed her case believes she needs a more aggressive approach to prevent long-term sensitivity issues. I'd like to schedule her for additional testing tomorrow if possible." Elaine's heart sank. More tests meant more bills they couldn't pay. "I understand, but—" "Is everything all right, Mrs. Miller?" Dr. Reynolds asked, picking up on the hesitation. "We're just managing a lot right now," Elaine replied, turning away so Sophie wouldn't see her expression. There was a pause before Dr. Reynolds spoke again. "I think we should discuss the financial assistance programs available through the hospital. Many families qualify but don't realize it." Elaine felt a flash of pride battling with necessity. They had always paid their own way, had never asked for handouts. But as she glanced at Sophie happily coloring at the table, her arms healing but still bearing the marks of their previous situation, she realized this wasn't the time for pride. "That would be helpful," she admitted finally. After arranging the appointment for the following day, Elaine hung up and took a deep breath. The folder of bills seemed to stare at her accusingly from the coffee table. Robert wouldn't be home until after midnight. The rent for their old apartment, which they were still responsible for until the lease expired, was due in 3 days. It was all too much. With a sudden, sharp pain shooting through her back, Elaine reached for her medication bottle only to find it empty. The room began to spin slightly as panic set in. How were they going to manage all of this? What if Sophie's condition returned? What if they lost this temporary housing? "Mom?" Sophie's concerned voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Are you okay? Your face looks funny." Elaine tried to smile reassuringly, but instead tears began rolling down her cheeks. She had reached her breaking point. "I'm just a little tired, sweetie," she managed to say. Sophie climbed onto the couch beside her mother and wrapped her small arms around Elaine's shoulders. "It's okay to cry sometimes," Sophie said with the simple wisdom of childhood. "That's what you always tell me, and Officer Parker says that asking for help is brave, not weak." In that moment, with her daughter comforting her instead of the other way around, Elaine made a decision. It was time to be brave. It was time to ask for help. Reaching for her phone again, she dialed the number Officer Parker had given them for emergencies. Because if this wasn't an emergency, this moment of drowning while trying to keep everyone else afloat, then what was? Officer Parker arrived at the Riverside Apartments within 30 minutes of Elaine's call. He found her sitting on the couch with Sophie curled up beside her, both looking up when he knocked on the door frame of the already open apartment. "I'm sorry to bother you," Elaine began, embarrassment coloring her voice. "I shouldn't have—" "You absolutely should have," Parker interrupted gently, stepping inside. He was carrying a paper bag from the local pharmacy and a folder tucked under his arm. "Sophie, I brought something for Hoppy. Would you mind checking in the side pocket of my jacket?" While Sophie eagerly investigated and discovered a tiny handmade vest that would fit her rabbit perfectly, Parker sat down across from Elaine. "Robert called me from the garage," he explained quietly. "He was worried when he couldn't reach you." "My phone died," Elaine admitted, "and I couldn't handle one more thing today." Parker nodded understandingly, then placed the pharmacy bag on the coffee table. "Your medication refill. The hospital has a patient assistance program that covers it completely. Dr. Reynolds helped expedite the paperwork this afternoon." Elaine stared at the bag in disbelief. "How did you know?" Robert mentioned you were running low, and medical conditions don't politely wait until finances improve. He smiled briefly before his expression turned more serious. Elaine, there's something else we need to discuss. The laboratory called with Sophie's comprehensive test results. At the mention of her name, Sophie looked up from where she was fitting Hoppy with his new vest. Are they talking about the invisible spots in my blood? She asked matter-of-factly. Parker exchanged a glance with Elaine before answering. Something like that, Sophie. The doctors have been looking very carefully at why your arms got so itchy. Can I show Officer Parker my arms, Mom? Sophie asked excitedly. They're getting better. Elaine nodded, and Sophie proudly displayed her healing skin, much improved from the angry inflammation of just a week ago. That looks great, Sophie, Parker said with genuine relief. Why don't you take Hoppy to show him your room while I talk to your mom for a few minutes? Once Sophie had skipped away, Parker opened the folder he'd brought. Dr. Reynolds wanted me to bring these results to you personally rather than waiting for tomorrow's appointment. He spread out several papers containing charts, graphs, and medical terminology, too complex for a layperson to fully understand. One page, however, had been marked with a yellow highlighter. This is the important part, Parker explained, pointing to the highlighted section. The comprehensive testing found something unexpected. Sophie has a specific genetic variation that makes her particularly sensitive to certain chemical compounds, specifically the exact type used at the plant where Robert works. Elaine's eyes widened. You mean this could have happened regardless of the mold? The mold certainly made it worse, but, according to Dr. Reynolds, Sophie would likely have developed a reaction to those chemicals eventually, even in a perfectly clean environment. It's an unusual genetic sensitivity that occurs in less than 2% of the population. So it wasn't just our failing as parents, Elaine whispered, a weight visibly lifting from her shoulders. It wasn't just the bad apartment or Robert bringing home chemicals or me not taking her complaint seriously enough. No, Parker confirmed. This was a medical condition that would have been nearly impossible to predict. The good news is that now that it's identified, it can be managed. Dr. Reynolds is already adjusting Sophie's treatment plan. From Sophie's room came the sound of cheerful chatter as she introduced Hoppy to all the features of their new temporary home. The innocent joy in her voice contrasted sharply with the serious conversation in the living room. There's more, Parker continued, turning to another page. The hospital has enrolled Sophie in a research program studying this genetic variation. It's completely voluntary, but it comes with comprehensive medical coverage for her condition. For the first time in days, perhaps weeks, Elaine felt a glimmer of hope breaking through the clouds of worry that had enveloped her family. Does Robert know all this? She asked. Parker nodded. He's on his way home now. His boss at the garage gave him the night off when he heard about the situation. As if on cue, hurried footsteps sounded on the apartment stairs, and Robert appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath and still wearing his mechanic's uniform. I came as soon as I could, he said, eyes quickly finding Elaine. Is everything okay? Actually, she replied with a tentative smile, I think things might finally be starting to get better. The following morning, Officer Parker pulled into the sprawling industrial complex that housed Midwest Chemical Solutions, where Robert had worked the night shift for the past 3 months. The facility was larger than Parker had expected, a maze of buildings, storage tanks, and loading docks spread across several acres. He'd come partly out of professional obligation, but mostly because of a growing personal investment in the Miller family's situation. If Sophie's condition had a genetic component that made her specifically sensitive to chemicals used in this facility, then other workers' families might be at risk too. At the security gate, he presented his badge and explained his purpose. After several phone calls and a 15-minute wait, a harried-looking man in a button-down shirt and safety helmet approached. Officer Parker, I'm Howard Delaney, Environmental Safety Compliance Manager. How can I help the police department today? His tone was polite but cautious. I'm following up on a public health case involving one of your employees, Robert Miller, Parker explained. His daughter developed a severe skin condition linked to chemical exposure from residue on his work clothes. Howard's expression shifted from caution to genuine concern. Miller from the solvent processing unit. Is his daughter going to be all right? She's improving now that she's been removed from exposure, Parker replied, studying the manager's reaction. What can you tell me about the decontamination protocols for workers in that unit? Howard gestured for Parker to follow him inside. They passed through a security checkpoint and entered a large administrative building. We follow all OSHA guidelines, Howard explained as they walked. Workers in high-exposure areas shower on site before leaving and are provided with clean uniforms daily. Then why was Robert bringing contaminated clothing home? Parker asked. Howard stopped walking and turned to Parker with a frown. He shouldn't have been. That's explicitly against company policy. They continued to a conference room where Howard pulled up files on a computer. Miller started in February. He completed all required safety training. He pulled up a signed document. Here's his acknowledgement of the decontamination procedures. Parker studied the document, noting Robert's signature. Something wasn't adding up. Would it be possible to see the changing and decontamination facilities? He asked. 20 minutes later, Parker stood in the employee's locker room taking photos with his phone. The shower area was under construction, with a sign indicating, "Renovations in progress, temporary facilities in Building C." How long has this been under renovation? Parker asked, a theory forming in his mind. About 2 months, Howard admitted. We've set up alternative facilities, of course. In Building C, which is about a quarter mile across the complex, Howard finished, beginning to look uncomfortable. Parker continued his inspection, noting the distance to the temporary facilities, the limited number of lockers, and the industrial laundry collection bins that were nearly overflowing. Mr. Delaney, what's the policy if an employee needs to leave quickly for a family emergency? Parker asked. They're still required to follow decontamination protocols, Howard replied automatically, then hesitated. Though I suppose with the temporary setup being so far away. Parker nodded. And if an employee is working 2 jobs with tight scheduling between shifts? Understanding dawned on Howard's face. You think Miller was skipping proper decontamination because of time constraints. I think your renovations created a situation where following proper protocols became significantly more difficult for employees with complicated lives, Parker corrected diplomatically. As they exited the locker room, they passed a bulletin board with employee announcements. Parker noticed a flyer about chemical safety that featured a photo of a smiling family. The slogan read, "Protect yourself, protect your family, follow all decontamination procedures." May I take one of these? Parker asked, pointing to the flyer. Back in the administrative building, Howard led Parker to a small office where a woman was reviewing safety reports. This is Linda from Human Resources, Howard introduced her. Linda, can you pull up the clock-out times for Robert Miller over the past month? Linda quickly accessed the records. Miller consistently clocks out exactly at 7 a.m., right at shift change. And what time does the garage where he works open? Parker asked. 7:30 a.m., Linda replied after a quick internet search. It's about 20 minutes away with morning traffic. The picture became clearer. Robert had been caught in an impossible situation. Properly decontaminating would make him late for his second job, potentially costing him that income. But skipping proper procedures had unknowingly put Sophie at risk. Mr. Delaney, Parker said finally, I believe we have a systemic issue here rather than an individual failure to follow protocols. Howard nodded slowly. I think you're right. These renovations have gone on longer than planned, and we haven't adequately considered the impact on employees' ability to comply with safety requirements. As Parker prepared to leave, Howard asked, How is Miller's daughter doing now? Sophie's improving, Parker replied. But she has a rare genetic sensitivity to some of the compounds used here. Even with perfect protocols, she might have eventually developed symptoms. I'd like to help, Howard said unexpectedly. Not just for liability reasons, but because this is exactly the kind of situation our safety programs are supposed to prevent. Would Miller consider coming back if we could offer him a position away from chemical exposure? Perhaps in safety training, given his first-hand experience? Parker studied the man's face and saw genuine concern there. I think that's a conversation worth having. The county courthouse was an imposing building of red brick and white columns that had stood in the center of town for over a century. Inside, its high ceilings and polished wooden benches gave it an air of solemnity that made Sophie whisper when she spoke. "Why do we have to be so quiet?" she asked her mother, clutching Hoppy tightly to her chest. The rabbit was wearing his special vest, which Sophie had decided made him official enough for court. "It's a way of showing respect," Elaine explained, smoothing Sophie's dress for the third time, like in the library or church. The Millers sat in the front row of a small hearing room, waiting for the proceedings to begin. This wasn't a criminal trial, but a special hearing regarding their housing situation and the landlord's responsibility for the unsafe conditions in their former apartment. Robert sat stiffly in his suit, borrowed from Officer Parker, who sat beside them. On Elaine's other side was Dr. Reynolds, reviewing her notes one final time. The opposite side of the room held a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who kept checking his watch impatiently. Mr. Grayson, their former landlord. The bailiff called the room to order as Judge Martinez entered, a stern-looking woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that immediately found Sophie. "I see we have a young person joining us today," she noted, her expression softening slightly. "Hello there." "Hello," Sophie replied solemnly. "This is Hoppy. He's nervous about being in court." A ripple of gentle laughter broke the tension in the room, and even Judge Martinez smiled. "Well, you can tell Hoppy that there's nothing to be nervous about. We're all here to figure things out together." She turned to the adults. "Now, let's proceed with case number 479B, regarding unsafe housing conditions at 1423 Maple Street." The hearing began with the county inspector presenting her findings: extensive mold contamination, roof leaks, inadequate ventilation, and several code violations that had existed long before the Millers moved in. Photos displayed on a screen showed the dark patches in Sophie's room that she had called monsters. Mr. Grayson's attorney argued that the Millers had never formally complained about these issues in writing, as required by the lease. "Your Honor," Robert spoke up, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness, "we made multiple phone calls to the maintenance number. We were always told that someone would come, but no one ever did." Judge Martinez looked at Mr. Grayson. "Do you have records of these calls, Mr. Grayson?" The landlord shifted uncomfortably. "Our call logging system had technical issues during that period." Dr. Reynolds testified next about Sophie's condition, explaining the relationship between the mold, chemical exposure, and her rare genetic sensitivity. "While Sophie's particular reaction was unusual due to her genetic makeup, Your Honor, the mold levels in that apartment would have eventually caused respiratory issues for any occupant, particularly children whose immune systems are still developing." Throughout the testimony, Sophie sat quietly drawing in a sketchbook Parker had given her. Occasionally, she would hold up her artwork for her parents to see, pictures of their family in front of different houses, each one brighter and happier than the last. When it was the landlord's turn to speak, he expressed regret about the conditions but claimed financial hardship had prevented him from making needed repairs. "With all due respect, Mr. Grayson," Judge Martinez responded, reviewing his financial disclosure forms, "you own 17 rental properties in this county. The financial records indicate you've undertaken extensive renovations on several of them in the past year, yet you neglected basic safety measures in the Millers unit." The judge then did something unexpected. She turned to Sophie. "Sophie, may I see what you've been drawing?" Shyly, Sophie approached the bench and handed over her sketchbook. Judge Martinez carefully turned the pages, studying each drawing. "These are very good," she said kindly. "I notice in this one, you've drawn your family in front of a house with a red door. Is that a special house?" Sophie nodded. "That's our someday house, the one with no monsters in the walls." The room fell silent as the simple wisdom of a child cut through the legal arguments. Judge Martinez handed back the sketchbook and straightened in her chair. "I'm ready to make my ruling." She ordered Mr. Grayson to refund the Miller's security deposit and last 3 months' rent, plus pay for medical expenses related to Sophie's condition. Additionally, he was required to complete all necessary repairs under county supervision before renting the unit again. Furthermore, she continued, the County Housing Authority will conduct inspections of all your properties, Mr. Grayson, to ensure similar conditions don't exist elsewhere. As the hearing concluded, Sophie tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Does this mean the monsters have to follow the rules now too? Robert knelt beside his daughter, his eyes shining with unshed tears of relief. Yes, sweetheart, the monsters have to follow the rules now. Outside the courthouse, standing in warm sunshine that felt symbolic of their brightening fortunes, the Millers found themselves surrounded by their unexpected support system. Officer Parker, Dr. Reynolds, and even Howard Delaney from the chemical plant. I have something for you, Howard said, handing Robert an envelope. It's a formal job offer, safety training coordinator. No chemical exposure, regular hours, and better pay than your current positions combined. As Robert stammered his thanks, Parker noticed Sophie watching the adults with a satisfied expression, as if she had known all along that things would work out. What are you thinking about, Sophie? He asked. She smiled, hugging Hoppy close. I'm thinking that grown-ups are a lot like kids. Sometimes they need help seeing the monsters, and sometimes they need help making them go away. News travels quickly in small towns, and the story of the Miller family had spread throughout Pinewood County. What began as whispers about a mysterious 911 call had transformed into a tale of environmental hazards, corporate responsibility, and a community coming together. 2 weeks after the courthouse hearing, the Riverside Apartments community room was filled with people, all gathered for what had been simply advertised as a neighborhood support meeting. Sophie sat at a small table near the entrance, proudly showing visitors her arms, now completely clear of the angry rashes that had plagued her for months. See? All better, she announced to Mrs. Jenkins, her second-grade teacher who had stopped by. The monsters are gone and Daddy doesn't bring home his cloud anymore. Officer Parker stood by the refreshment table, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. What had begun as a routine response call had evolved into something much more meaningful. He sipped his coffee as Dr. Reynolds joined him. I still can't believe how many people showed up, she remarked, surveying the crowded room. Indeed, the gathering included an unlikely assortment of community members. Neighbors from their old apartment building, Robert's colleagues from both the garage and the chemical plant, medical staff from the county health center, and even Judge Martinez, who had arrived without her robes but with the same authoritative presence. People want to help when they understand the problem, Parker replied. The hard part is making the invisible visible. At the center of the room, Elaine sat with a small group of women deep in conversation. For the first time since Parker had met her, she wasn't wincing in pain or clutching her back. The county's medical assistance program had connected her with a pain management specialist who had developed a treatment plan that relied less on medication and more on targeted physical therapy. Mrs. Miller seems transformed, Dr. Reynolds observed. She told me yesterday that she's planning to start a support group for parents dealing with chronic health conditions, Parker said. Said she wanted to help others navigate the systems she had to figure out the hard way. The room's attention shifted as Howard Delaney from Midwest Chemical Solutions stood up to make an announcement. Beside him was Robert, looking remarkably different in business casual attire rather than his mechanic's uniform or factory coveralls. As many of you know, what happened to the Miller family has prompted some significant changes at our facility, Howard began. I'm pleased to announce that Midwest Chemical has completely revamped our decontamination protocols and implemented a new family safety initiative that Robert here will be heading up. Robert stepped forward, his usual shyness tempered by a new sense of purpose. What happened to Sophie could have happened to any of our families, he said. Our new program ensures that workers have proper changing facilities, on-site laundry for contaminated clothing, and regular home testing kits to check for chemical residue. The crowd applauded, and Sophie beamed proudly at her father from her table. In another corner of the room, County Housing Inspector Diane Woods was showing architectural drawings to a group of interested residents. These are the new minimum standards for rental properties, she explained. The county council unanimously approved them last week. Landlords now have 6 months to bring all properties up to code, with special emphasis on mold prevention and remediation. Parker felt a tug on his sleeve and looked down to find Sophie standing beside him. "Officer Parker, can I show you something?" she asked, her eyes bright with excitement. She led him to a display table where dozens of children's drawings were arranged in neat rows. Each one depicted a house, a family, or scenes of community helpers like doctors, teachers, and police officers. "My whole class made these," Sophie explained. "Ms. Jenkins had us draw pictures about people who help. After I told everyone about how you and Dr. Reynolds saved me from the monsters, she's going to hang them in the school hallway." Parker knelt down to examine the artwork, genuinely touched by the children's perspectives. One drawing in particular caught his eye. A police officer standing beside a little girl, both of them facing what appeared to be a large, fuzzy gray blob with fangs. "Is this supposed to be me?" he asked, pointing to the figure in blue. Sophie nodded solemnly. "That's when you helped me fight the monsters. Ms. Jenkins said it's a metaphor." "A metaphor?" Parker suggested gently. "Yeah, that. It means the monsters aren't really monsters, but they're still scary. And sometimes kids need grown-ups to see them too." From the wisdom of children, Parker thought. He had responded to thousands of calls in his career, but few had affected him as deeply as Sophie's quiet voice saying, "This happens when I'm alone with Daddy." Across the room, Robert caught his eye and nodded in silent gratitude. In that moment, Parker was reminded why he had become a police officer in the first place. Not just to enforce laws, but to protect the vulnerable and help families find their way through difficult times. As the gathering continued, the atmosphere was one of community and hope. A reminder that sometimes the most important changes begin with a single phone call, a careful listener, and the courage to look beyond the surface of a problem to its complex human core. 6 months had passed since Sophie's fateful 911 call. The leaves had changed colors, fallen, and given way to a light dusting of early winter snow that transformed Pinewood County into a picture-perfect scene. On Maple Street, a small house with fresh paint and a newly repaired roof stood waiting. A "For Rent" sign had been replaced with a colorful handmade poster that read, "Welcome Home Millers," decorated with glitter and drawings of smiling faces. A modest procession of cars pulled up to the curb. The first was Robert's, now free of any chemical residue and carrying precious cargo, Sophie, Elaine, and Hoppy the rabbit, who peered curiously from his special traveling case. The second car belonged to Officer Parker, who had insisted on being present for this moment. Dr. Reynolds arrived next, followed by several neighbors and friends who had become an extended family over the past months. "Is this really our house now, Daddy?" Sophie asked as they approached the front walkway. "It really is," Robert confirmed, a proud smile lighting up his face. "Remember how the judge ordered Mr. Grayson to fix everything? Well, he decided to sell the building instead. And guess who helped us get approved for a first-time homebuyer program?" Sophie's eyes widened. "Officer Parker?" "Officer Parker," Elaine confirmed, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Along with about a dozen other people who believed in us." The front door was painted a bright red, exactly like the one in Sophie's drawings. Robert ceremoniously handed Sophie a shiny key. "Would you like to do the honors?" With all the solemnity a 7-year-old could muster, Sophie inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door swung open to reveal a completely transformed interior. Where once there had been peeling wallpaper and water stains, the walls now gleamed with fresh paint. The musty smell had been replaced by the scent of clean wood and new beginnings. "No monsters," Sophie whispered, stepping inside cautiously. "No monsters," Robert agreed, following her. "The whole house has been inspected twice, and Howard even brought over special equipment to check for any chemical residues. It's completely safe." As their friends filed in behind them, Sophie ran from room to room, exploring her new home with Hoppy clutched tightly in her arms. Her bedroom had been painted a soft yellow, with a new window that let in streams of winter sunlight. The ceiling corners, once dark with mold, now met in perfect, clean lines. In the living room, Dr. Reynolds presented Elaine with a framed certificate. "This officially completes Sophie's participation in our research program," she explained. "Her case has already helped us identify 3 other children in the county with similar genetic sensitivities. The protocols we developed for her care will benefit countless families." Officer Parker had brought his own gift, a small wooden plaque that read, "Home is where your story begins." "I thought this might be appropriate," he said, "considering how your family's story has unfolded." As everyone gathered in the modest living room, sharing refreshments and well wishes, Sophie tugged on Parker's sleeve, motioning for him to follow her to a quiet corner. From her backpack, she withdrew a carefully folded piece of paper. "I made this for you," she said, handing it to him. Parker unfolded the drawing to find a colorful scene depicting a police officer, a doctor, a family, and various community members all standing together around a house with a red door. Above them, written in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "Sometimes the scary things aren't what we think they are." "That's very wise, Sophie," Parker said, genuinely moved. She shrugged with the simple confidence of childhood. "I learned that monsters can be invisible, like mold or chemicals, but so can heroes, like people who help even when it's not their job." From across the room, Robert called everyone's attention. "Elaine and I want to thank all of you," he began, his arm around his wife's shoulders. 6 months ago, we were drowning, financially, emotionally, medically. We thought we were failing as parents because we couldn't provide a safe home for Sophie. What we didn't realize," Elaine continued, "was that a safe home isn't just about the building. It's about the community around you, the people who see you struggling and reach out instead of looking away." As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows through the new windows, the gathering slowly dispersed with promises to return soon. Finally, only the Millers remained in their new home, standing together in the quiet living room. "What do you think, Sophie?" Robert asked. "Is this the house from your drawings?" Sophie considered the question seriously, looking around at the modest but clean and safe space they now called home. "It's even better," she decided finally, "because it's real." Later that evening, as Sophie slept peacefully in her new bedroom, with Hoppy keeping watchful guard from the nearby shelf, Robert and Elaine sat on their front porch, wrapped in blankets against the winter chill. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Elaine asked softly. "If Sophie hadn't made that call?" Robert nodded, watching his breath form clouds in the cold air. Every day, one phone call changed everything. Inside, Sophie dreamed of red doors and friendly monsters that had been transformed into guardian angels, watching over her family in their healing home.